Okay, awesome. We're recording. So I guess it's time to get this workshop officially started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our second workshop of the semester. My name is Guillermo Valle. I'm one of your ACM officers. And so today's workshop is going to be a workshop on React, which is a very popular front-end framework. This workshop is going to be done by Carl Respicio, who has a lot of experience with React. So I'll let him take it from here.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Kara Spicio, and I'm super excited to be giving this React workshop today. So when creating this, I assumed that essentially that everyone didn't really have any knowledge of like web development stuff because they didn't really know what the audience was. And so I just want to say thank you for coming, and let's get the show started. So firstly, we're going to go ahead and talk about different web fundamentals and different types of technology needed to go ahead and get started in terms of using React and making different web pages. After that, I'm going to give a little more detail of what is React and what is it good for, who uses it, and stuff like that. And then obviously, if I just lecture all day, you won't learn anything. So I'm going to do a little demonstration. And I believe a link was posted into chat or into Discord to a little Codepen where we'll open up and we'll do some development in terms of making a tic-tac-toe game. And then finally, we're gonna, at the end, I'm just gonna have some questions and a survey for the next workshop, because I believe I'm going to do another one again. So I just wanna see some feedback. And also feel free to open the mic up and ask a question anytime. It can get a little confusing, so I'm glad to go on this journey with you guys. Okay, so I just want to start with the very basics, like what are the different things that make up a web page? So first we have HTML. So HTML is essentially the bones of a web page. It defines the structure of the page. So I made a little example here. So this is just some HTML code for this page right here. So all it is we see. So this is the dev tools. If you click Command Option I for Mac users, or I believe it's like Command or Control Shift I for Windows users, we can go ahead and open the dev tools if you guys can get that started up. And we'll see that this is the HTML script. And then so we can see here that we have the HTML. So everything lives within the HTML code. And there's typically a head portion and a body. So the head refers to like outside factors and this tab over here. So we see that the title is named example. So if you were to edit this, so if you double click on this, you can go ahead and change it to whatever, and this will update at the same time. In general, this dev tool right here is really good for understanding like what UI components are doing what and where everything is centered. And so here we enter the body. This P simply just means paragraph, and we can type in like different things here as well. And then so every web page will have access to this HTML code. We can see that this Google page is far more complicated than the other. And we can see in this one, the text is kind of ugly, right? And so if you want your website to look a little cleaner or whatnot, you have to add CSS. So essentially CSS is the skin or the aesthetics of what the bones might look like. And so if we see in this diagram over here, we see that just the raw HTML, it's this weird wonky thing and everything's stacked and like, it just doesn't look good, right? It's not until you add CSS for you to add flavor and make the components cohesive into one thing. So for example, we can add style in one way by explicitly putting it into the head of the HTML code. So here, if I uncomment this, it says we have style, and the type is CSS, which is the styling language. And then here it says P. So like I said earlier, P was the tag that determined that this was going to be a paragraph, right? Or this is just some text, right? So I'm just saying that I'm gonna apply a color, this color, and it doesn't even have to be like a weird hexadecimal color. You could just put like blue or something, and that would work as well. And we can see that it'll actually change everything in the paragraphs to be a different color. So if we refresh the page, we'll see that it's back to blue. Awesome. And then there's also another way to add style. So typically it's frowned upon to put like inline styling and just have your style like in the HTML files. And so what we have typically is another file that just contains all of the CSS and all the different stylings you want to apply to and just link it in. And then it just works the same exact way. And then this one was a different color. And we can see if you add different things, like maybe you want the text to be aligned in the center, you can just go ahead and add that and you'll see that it'll update as well. So that's pretty cool. And then so our next component would be the JavaScript component. So JavaScript is basically the muscles of the whole operation. So we can have like this, our bones and skin and have something look pretty, but it's not very functional and doesn't do anything. If you look at this, there's nothing I really do. And so we would want more components in terms of making it more active. And that's where we go ahead and add a little more JavaScript. I'm not going to cover too much on JavaScript right now. JavaScript is kind of like a big thing. But here, if we go into the console, we can see like this is where like typically your JavaScript code lives. And there's some essentials that you can do, such as like printing. It'll be console.log. And then you can put in a string. So maybe like hi, right? And it just prints out hi to the console. Okay, and if we take another dissection of this Google page, we can see all the different HTML code and you can see these little scripts. So essentially these embedded scripts will do different things. So JavaScript is what lets you click on Google search to do something, right? So if I put in React here, and if I type in Google, press this button, it takes me to the next page. And the only way that was possible is through JavaScript. Awesome. Do we have any questions? Okay, good. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little more about the DOM. Because when you start doing a lot of like front end stuff, you'll hear this word like everywhere. They'll just talk about the DOM. Essentially, our web page is organized as a document. So you can just imagine like it's one, like a piece of paper or something, right? So we have the DOM as a piece of paper and there's different elements it has. One is the root element, and that's going to be the actual HTML file itself. So we can see here that even when we inspect Google's website, we see that it is of type HTML, and we see that this HTML is basically a huge container for everything within it. And as I said earlier, there's typically two parts of the HTML. We see the head, which has different external factors, and then the body over here. And we can see that also in Google's code. We see the head portion and then some of the body. So, and then I think it's cool to note that if you click here, we can actually inspect a UI component on this web page. So if I click it, it'll bring up this thing and we can see different factors within this web page. So let's say I want to know a little more about the code behind this I'm feeling lucky button. So I can go ahead and click this and then click on the I'm feeling lucky, and it will take me directly here. And as I showed you earlier, we can click on the value and actually change what it says. So you could say just like hello world or something. And it'll change automatically in here. So if you ever want to, and a good exercise if you want to really learn about HTML and CSS is to rebuild websites essentially by looking at like, oh, this is how it's spaced. And these are the elements that go into this website. And so down here as well, we can see a little more about the CSS. So we see that this button actually has a lot of different CSS components to it to make it look this way. Awesome. Okay, so now I'm going to go a little more into what is React. So React is essentially an open source front-end JavaScript library that helps you build user interfaces. So if you can do everything with just raw HTML and CSS and JavaScript, but that can get a little taxing because there's just so many things you need to think about in terms of like, what does this button do if I do this? What do I what happens if you do this? And then you would have to use this old library called jQuery to actually make things like update in time. So like, for example, if we go to like this Khan Academy website, if I like click on something to move down, like, or if I wanted to change this within the code, like the title, I would have to use like jQuery to manually do it. But React helps us manage all of that into like these succinct files. Moreover, React, it has a virtual DOM setting, which essentially makes it so whenever something needs to be updated, it can quickly update that DOM I was talking about earlier, the document, and just quickly change like the title of a page or something, or maybe you want to swap out the image of this. And it does it like instantaneously, and it looks really nicely done in comparison to how other things are rendered if you weren't to use React. And also React puts everything into huge components. And so a component is essentially, let's say on this Google page, right? We see this search bar here. And if I Google something, we see the search bar again pop up here. So a lot of the times it's like, why should I rebuild the same thing if I already have built it in the past? So with React, we can make things into components. So let's say like the search bar, and we can go ahead and use that in different areas without having to rebuild our code in terms of making new UI components. And in general, it's really good for single page applications. So what that means is a lot of the times, like some websites, let's take Twitter, for example, things update on that page. So it doesn't really look like a lot of things have changed, but instead like the content is being refreshed instead of like me going to a new page. A good example of this as well is if we go to the Khan Academy website, if I click on courses, we don't see that it takes us to a different page. It actually just changes this state in terms of like, oh, is courses open or is courses closed? Awesome. And then this picture just demonstrates like who uses React. So we see that, you know, a lot of people use React. It was actually created by Facebook and it's open source and you can contribute to it if you'd like. And I feel like it's one of those, if you're going to get into front end like development, or if you're doing UI, React is definitely like a good choice in terms of getting started and getting you to where you are. And it's just, if you're thinking about like your career as well, a lot of employers do look for like, oh, you know React, like that's good. That's good to know. Awesome. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and start our demonstration. So we're essentially going to be doing the hello world of React. So React has this React tic-tac-toe game that it's a basically, it's just tic-tac-toe, but with the ability to go back into to see our history of like moves and stuff. I'm not sure if we have enough time to get into how to change back to the past and whatnot. So today we'll just be making this simple tic-tac-toe game. So let me go ahead and send you guys the Codepen again, just in case you guys don't have it. So I sent something in Zoom that if you click on this link, essentially, it'll take you to here. And also where I got this example is from the React website tutorial, which you can click there and you'll see that in this workshop specifically, I won't be following it exactly, but it was inspired after this basic tutorial.
The Codepen is also on the Discord channel as well.
Awesome, cool. Good to know. Okay. So I'm just gonna like wait like 30 seconds so everyone can get acquainted and get the Codepen started up and whatnot.
Yeah, just give us a yes on Zoom, you know, like the little symbol under your participants tab, if you're ready to go.
Yeah, I'll put like what is it? The thumbs up emoji.
Or thumbs up.
Or
Just
something, yeah. So now we can go ahead and get started. Okay, Sherman. I see Ryan's.
Yeah, and leave them up.
Awesome. Okay. So I feel like a good amount of people have thumbs up. Right?
Yeah, we can get started.
Awesome. We're going to go ahead and get started. So if you look at this code, there's a lot going on. So first we have, if you move this over, we can see the HTML, CSS, and the JavaScript. Today, we're primarily going to be working in the JavaScript territory. Since React, most of your files you're going to be dealing with they're called JSX because it's a combination of like JavaScript and a combination of like HTML, because normally you can't do this in regular JavaScript, but with React, it lets you actually return HTML code. So if we saw earlier, we saw the little brackets to indicate like, oh, this is HTML, like this is a button, this is a paragraph, and we'll see that again in this JavaScript portion. And then so for right now, we're just gonna ignore the HTML and CSS in terms of what we're coding today.
I actually want to take a pause right there. Does anybody have any questions about this concept? Right, I don't see any. All right, let's keep going.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, feel free to ask questions because I feel like this is where like it kind of like spikes in terms of difficulty, because I didn't really go in depth of like JavaScript stuff. So I'm hoping that this will make some sort of sense to you guys in terms of like you understanding what a class is and whatnot. And so let's take a look at what's inside of our JavaScript file. So we see that there's a square class, a board class, a game class. And at the very bottom, we see this thing that's like React DOM.render. So essentially what this portion right here is doing, it's saying that we're going to grab the root of the element of the document. So here, if we go back to my screen, the document always has a root element. So we're essentially saying with this function, I'm going to replace this whole entire root with this JSX code or with this React code. So I'm going to be putting in my game at the root of the document.
Sorry, we have a question on chat.
Okay.
Not sure if you know the answer to this, but Sherman Lee asked if JSX is similar to Razor in .NET.
Yeah, Sherman, can you actually explain Razor a little more? I have never worked with .NET, so.
So Razor basically is like, I think you're kind of like saying the same thing where like since JavaScript is combining both, no, the JSX file is like combining both JavaScript and HTML and allowing the logical parts of JavaScript to produce any HTML. Like, would it be similar? Because like Razor basically incorporates C# to produce any like HTML onto the page.
Right. So from what I'm hearing, I believe they are like roughly similar. So yeah, but just be with JavaScript instead of C#.
Okay, sounds good.
Awesome. Thanks for the question, Sherman. Anyways, so we're going to be rendering the game onto the DOM or to the document, right? So let's go ahead and see what the game class is. So we see that this game class extends a React component. So it's just saying that this game is going to be a component, as I talked about earlier with the, like this toolbar would be a component, right? And so we want the game to use React code and to be a component. So whenever a class is a React component, they need to have one thing. So classes can have like different functions within it, but they always must have a render function. And essentially this render function just renders the UI. And so you'll see that it returns HTML code, which is, it returns JSX, which is a blend of HTML and JS code. Whenever you see, so right here, this is HTML, but if you see these brackets, it simply means that we're going to escape to JavaScript. So here I can put like 4 + 5. And so we'll see 9 right here, right? But if I were to do it outside of the JavaScript, and I did like 4 + 5 here, it's going to take it as a literal instead, because it's just posting it as a string instead of evaluating because it's not in JavaScript. This is technically in regular HTML, if that makes sense. Okay. And so let's go back to the game. We see that we're going to be rendering a div. Essentially, a div is just a container for everything else to live in. And one thing to note is that when the render function can only return one object. So if you want to return like 2 buttons, you have to put the 2 buttons inside a bigger container and then return that container. So in this example, we're going to be returning just this game div, which again is just like a box for everything to hold in. And then so we see that inside, there's another div that's just going to hold the board. So typically in React, if it's capitalized, it means that it's a component we explicitly defined. So I'm going to scroll up and see that we have defined it, and here is a board, right? And so we're going to render this board component, which I assume is going to be this component right here. And then there's nothing really else that's happening in this render function for the game. So now let's see what the board is rendering. So the board, it looks like, so as it is a class, you can have multiple functions. So in this class, it has a render square function, and then the regular render function that is used to render the graphics. So here it's saying that we're going to, there's a div for the status. So we can say like hi here, and we'll see that this gets updated. So this bar right here is just saying this is where this text lies. Okay, and then this status is from this variable that was declared earlier and this string literal.
We have another question on chat if you
Awesome.
want to check that out.
Yeah. Okay. So are the classes globally defined in sense? The game class doesn't take in the game board as a parameter, but is still able to render it. Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So thank you for asking, Stone. This is the same file, actually. So it's technically a global variable just because the game knows of board because board is above it. And so it's in the same scope. But when you actually make different, like if you actually make a React project, you'll separate each component by a file. And so if you wanted to render this board, you would actually have to import it from another thing. So you would say like import board from, and then you would insert the file name. So it would be like, let's say you want, so these are components, right? So typically we have a component file, and then we want like, let's say we wanted board, right? So typically this is how you would import the board. So we would be in scope of determining that variable. Does that make sense? Awesome. Cool. Okay. And then so here, back to the board, we see these render squares. Essentially what this is doing, it's calling the render square. Does anyone know what the keyword this might mean in this context? Does anyone have a clue?
Feel free to unmute yourself or type it out in chat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Close. Right. Okay. So Ryan got it. So this is actually referring to the class that it's inside. Since we're inside of the board, this is referring to the board. So we're saying that we're going to call the render square function inside of the board, which is right here. And we see that it just returns a square. And so we see this and we know that, oh, like this must be another component for HTML and JSX. And if you go up, we actually see square again, and we see that it is a React component, and it has that render function again, and we see that all it does, it returns a button. So this might not look like a button, but we styled it to look like one. So whenever you see class name equals and then something, it actually means that we're going to use a styling that has the name of square. So if we go to our CSS, we can see square right here, and we can see all these different styles that are applied to it. So if I change this FFF, which is white, and we change it to blue, we'll see that all of this changes to blue actually. Okay, so the first thing I want, oh, does that make sense in terms of how this UI is structured? Are we good on that? Or is there anything that needs clarifying?
Sherman has another question on chat. What is the difference between class and class name?
Okay, so typically if you're using HTML, we say class equals the CSS class. But since we're talking about like the JavaScript class, like I'm gonna declare a class, there needs to be a distinction between the keyword class referring to HTML and the keyword class referring to JavaScript. So this class is referring to JavaScript and this class name is referring to this CSS component. If you were to put in class here, sometimes it works, but sometimes it throws an error like right here. I recommend that you never do that and you always go ahead and use class name. Awesome. Yeah. Spot on, Matthew. Okay. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to have us do is try to put something inside of these squares, right? So and when you play tic-tac-toe, normally it's an X or a circle. But if we see how the squares are rendered, we're actually passing in a number, right? So 0 would correspond to the 0 parts of the grid, which would be right here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And we can see that this is what the code is doing. So let's go ahead and try to display the numbers on these boxes just for fun, right?
We have another question on chat from Stone Cha. When making component files, should we use the .jsx extension instead of the JS extension, or will either work?
Either will work. I think most of the time I just see JS, but I personally like seeing JSX because I use Visual Code Studio and I feel like it formats my code a lot better if it's JSX, but it really doesn't, like, it's up to you, but both will work in either case. So yeah. Awesome. And if we have enough time at the end, we can go ahead and like actually make a React project on your computer. So you can like go ahead and like see what it's like to dev in that environment instead of this like fake Codepen, right? So I was saying we're rendering the squares and we're passing an argument of the index of the square. So if we go back here, we're not doing anything with I, right? So let's go ahead and give that index to our square. So how we can do that is we can just type like, let's say value equals, and I want to pass an I. So by doing this, we're essentially passing in a variable, a prop to the square component. So here we're with the name value, we're going to be sending in the parameter I, right? So if I actually do this, we can see that, oh, sorry. So we have this thing called props, which is what we're sending in terms of we're giving a prop to the square. And so if we do props.value, because it was named value, we can actually see the value, if that makes sense. So we have to do this because we're referring to the square class, and we do props because we're talking about something and we're giving it. So here I'm giving it a value. So I could name this anything I wanted to, like I could name this index, right? But this would no longer work because it doesn't know what index is. So we would have to change this to index, if that makes sense. Awesome. So now we're able to display some numbers onto this component, and we can see like there's different ways that components can interact to each other. So in this situation, we see that this square is actually like a child of the board because the board is using the square to do things, right?
We have another question. How would you pass in multiple values to a different component?
Right. So let's say I'm going to make a new random variable. Okay. Let's call it like Fred. And we're going to give it a value of 10. Okay. So if
Sorry, could you explain what let is?
Oh, yeah. So the university teaches C and C++, and everything is typed. So like you would have to do like int dog equals 10, right? In JavaScript, variables, they do have a type, but it's not explicitly declared, and you don't necessarily have to say this is an integer. So we can just say like let will just declare a variable Fred and assign it to the value of 10. So now Fred is an integer type, but we can also, everything's dynamically typed, but we could also do a string of like 10 and whatnot. JavaScript is very flexible in terms of how types are handled. And so let's say we have this variable, right? And I wanted to pass in like a new thing, and I want to call this like value. So you would just append to the previous code what you want to send in. So let's say I'm sending it so the square, I'm passing it index and value. Or maybe I want to call this thing like Fred again, right? And then the reason why I'm using these braces is because I'm escaping to JavaScript again. So here, I'm talking about this Fred. If you were to just take it out like this, it wouldn't compile correctly because it doesn't know what you're talking about because this is a variable. So to evaluate the variable, we would have to enclose it in these braces. And another note, let's say I just wanted it to pass in like a string like dog or something. You can go ahead and just do it like this. But you can always do the braces, which is what I recommend to do anyways. Does that answer your question? Imagine letting Fred be dog. Okay, awesome. Okay, cool. So now we have the numbers. So let's go ahead, instead of numbers, let's make it so if I click on it, it does something cool. So this is like a native property of React. So let's say for this button, this grid, this square, I want it to do something. So what you would do is do on click equals, and then again, we're going to do the braces, and I'm going to tell it what to do. So I want it to call a function. On click, you always pass a function to it so it does something. So let's say we do like a function, and then it's going to alert hello. Okay, and then there's like all these fun different like web functions you'll learn over experiences. I've linked some resources at the end for you to like overview and see like what kind of functions already exist, because the alert function is one that's already native to the web browser. So if we go ahead and click one of these squares, we see that we actually get an alert that says hello. Okay. And so we're calling a function here, right? There's another way to call a function. If you guys are familiar with Python, there's this notion of lambda functions or anonymous functions. And so it's always nice in React to use anonymous functions. Essentially what it does, it takes the scope of the thing that it's inside. So this function right here, anything inside this function is a different scope to this outside. So sometimes you want to use the same scope, and to do that, you use this symbol instead. So it's just going to be, so here would be where you put in your parameters or your argument, sorry. And so you could just do that. And like if you needed multiple, you could just add more. But here I'm not really passing anything important, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave it empty, and we'll see that it works the exact same way. So that's pretty neat. Okay. So now let's go ahead and actually put some meaningful values to this grid. So I'm going to go down. Okay. So if you think about this grid, it's essentially it's a 3x3 grid, or it's an array of different values, right? And so if we're making a board game of tic-tac-toe, we can think of like if there was nothing there, it's like null, right?
Sherman asked another question.
Oh.
Can you give an example where changing the scope of the functions is significant?
Yeah. So let's say I actually, okay. I'm gonna go back. Okay, let's say I want to alert like the number, right? So instead of just saying like, hi, I wanted to print out, oh, sorry, it reloaded. I wanted to print out like 2 instead of just a generic hi. So here we would do this dot props dot index. Go ahead and click it here. We see the 2. But see, this uses the scope of the outside class because it's an anonymous function. But if it was a regular function, this, okay, that's confusing. This keyword right here would refer to this square. And so if I were to click now, I get an error. So that's an example of where it'd be significant to use an anonymous function over a named function. So thanks, Sherman, for the clap. I appreciate it. Okay. Awesome. So now let's go ahead and add state to the board. So state is essentially what makes React React. It's a way for your components to know what is going on in terms of like where are we now? Like right now, this board should be, I'm going to comment this out. It should be empty, right? And so if I wanted to do something like click on this and then have like an X show up, we would need to change the state of the board and change the UI that goes along with that board. And as I said earlier, we can represent this board essentially as an array. So if you remember from maybe CS 202, if you've taken it, that each class has like some sort of constructor to when you first instantate that class, and that's the same thing that's going on in React, but you don't need to always explicitly say it. But in this case, we're going to want to because we're going to use some state. So you just say constructor, and then you always give it props. And then we do something called, oh, just ignore that for now. So we do this thing called super. And we essentially, it calls like some things in the background to make sure that everything is loaded incorrectly. I don't know if I explained that correctly. Just know for now that you just need to write that in, or else some things don't get handled properly in terms of like stuff getting inherited and whatnot. And so now we're going to actually set the state. So you say this dot state equals, and then state always expects a dictionary, which in JavaScript is braces. And then so I'm going to say I want like my board squares, my squares, right? And then I want it to be an array. And then since there's 9 pieces in the board, I'm going to fill it with 9. And I want to start off with nothing inside of them. So I'm going to fill it with nothing. Awesome. Okay, so now we've added the state. And it's important that you always, when you first create the state, it always has to be done inside of the constructor. Okay, and so now I want it for, if I click on it, it's going to put in an actual value instead of just alert this number. So I'm going to make a function in the board, and I'm going to call it fill square. And then fill square is going to take the index of the square that I'm clicking on.
We have another question on the chat. What does the super props mean?
Yeah, so in terms of, there's a lot of things happening in the background of React. And so you want to make sure that your classes have inherited everything correctly. And by calling super, you ensure that everything is just in line in terms of the inheritance portion, if that makes sense.
Awesome. If I can ask you a question, so what exactly is the board class inheriting? So what? Because I see extends react.component.
Yeah. So I'm gonna be 100% honest. Like, I know this is mandatory, but I know it does like a lot of bad like things in the background. But I know that if you want, I don't know. I will get back to you guys on like why exactly. I just know that you need to have it, or else things can get a little wonky in terms of like having it inherited from the component and other things that it comes from.
Okay.
Right. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Nathaniel. Awesome. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot more sense. So if it inherited it from something, the super just calls the constructor of the inherited functions. So you just want to put it just to make sure everything's in a line. So back to the fill square function. So it's going to take in the index of where we click, and we're going to basically change the state of the board. So like the board right now is full of null. So if you click on index 0, instead of having a null in that array, in that position, we're going to change it to be like X or O, depending on the situation, right? Okay. So first we're going to change the state, we're going to do this dot set state. Okay. So that is a function.
Sorry. We have another comment on the chat.
Find this. I know things are just starting out and this might be fixed later as we instantate stuff, but for some reason, when I click alert, this.props.index returns undefined. So I'm not quite sure. I would have to take a look at your code explicitly to see like where you are and like what's missing. But from the sounds of it, I would ensure that one, you're passing in the index correctly. So this is index when you render the square, and you make sure you pass something that is already defined. And then ensuring that you're using an anonymous function instead of a regular function in terms of this square clicking. Hopefully it works out. If not, I can go at the end and help you to see what's going on. Okay. Okay, so we're going to set the state again. We're going to update the state so it changes what's inside of it. So if I fill it with like, let's say X's instead. Oh, wait, give me a second. Okay. So right now we have this array, but it's not passing anything down to the actual squares. So instead of passing down like index, I'm gonna change this back to value. Instead of passing down a number, we're gonna actually pass the position of that array. So this dot state, because it's part of the state, and then that variable is called squares. And since it is an array, we're going to reference that index. Okay, and then here I erased it. So this dot props dot value. And now we should see all the X's. Okay, and so now if you fill it with like O or something, this will change with all O's. So now I'm going to fill it with nothing. So let's say I want to change the state of that array so it can update correctly. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. We're going to do it this way at first. So we're going to change the state. It expects a dictionary of what's in the state. So we see in the state, we see that there's squares. So we're going to do squares, and we actually want to pass in let's pass in the squares, and then we're going to map it. All map is doing, it just iterates over the array to do different things, depending on the callback function that it's being passed to. So here we're going to be passing a function. It's going to take an element and then an index. So this is just something that's innate to map, that this first value right here is always going to be what the element in the array is. So if the array was full of numbers, it would be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then the second argument is always the index of that element. Okay, and then to do an anonymous function, we do that arrow thing. And then here we want it to essentially so this is what we're going to fill it up with. So if I fill it up with, like, if I do a 5 here, it essentially fills up this array with just 5s. But that's not what I want to do. So what I want is, if I click on this specific index, we want it to change that value to either X or O. So here we're going to say, so if the index, I'm going to change this to just I. So if I matches the index, we're going to return an X. We'll just do an X for now. And then elsewise, it's just going to stay null. Okay. And then so if I click it, nothing is going to happen. It's going to still be the alert thing because we need to update that as well. So I want this square button, when I call it, to actually call fill square. And so we can actually pass down a function. So if I go to this square, I can pass in like handle click equals fill square. Okay. But I also want it, oh, sorry. It's this dot fill square because we're referring to the class. And then I'm going to make this an anonymous function. Oh. So I can also pass in the index. Because if you don't, JS or React won't let you do this. This will throw an error. So you have to do it like this, because this is essentially assigning a function. And if you were to do this, you're not assigning a function anymore. You're assigning the result of that function, which would be undefined because this function doesn't return anything. Otherwise, we want to see a regular function be returned. So we have to turn this into a function. Okay, so now if I change this to instead, I want it to call this dot props dot handle click. Okay. Squares is not defined. Oh, sorry. So here, my mistake was that I need to talk about which square in specific, and you always have to say this dot state because it's part of the state. Okay, so now if we click on it, we see that we'll put an X to that position. Okay. Oh. Okay. Is there questions? I see a lot in the chat. Oh, we only have 12. We only have 7 minutes left. Okay, so I didn't think it was going to take this long. But I'm going to quickly show you how to change for it to be, instead of X's, I'm going to change it to O. So what you can do is have a variable called isXnext. And essentially it tells you whether or not we expect an X or an O to appear. And so let's do, so I want the entry, right? The either X or O. I want it to be equal to either X or O, depending on whether or not X is next. So if X is next, this is going to return an X, but if O is next, it's going to actually return O instead. So instead of doing this, I'm going to go ahead and send an entry. And the reason why I put L here was because it refers to what it previously was. And so I didn't want to change the state of other cells. I want that cell to stay the same. So if we see, we click, oh man. Sorry, I use a thing called hooks instead of like class components. So I like never have to write this. We can talk about, if I do another workshop, I could do like hooks, which is like I feel like much easier, but I know a lot of people use components rather than the hooks infrastructure. So if we click now, we'll see. Okay, I only have a few more minutes. Does anyone know why it's still X? I'm gonna wait like 30 seconds. And if not, I can just fix it. Does anyone have an idea? Okay, it's because we're not changing the is next state. So we're actually going to update it here when we click on something. So it should be the opposite of what it previously was. So this just nots it, so it just undoes it like that. And so we'll see that each time you click, it'll be a different number. And then this doesn't change primarily because if you look at the code, the status is hard coded in rather than using some other value. So what you could do is change this to whether or not is next is X next. We can either do X or O. Okay. Okay. If we click here, we'll see that this changes well. So we know the next player is going to be an X, and we see an X when we click. And then I'm going to go ahead and stop there because there's nothing further I can do in terms of like actual content. Sorry we didn't make it through the whole like tutorial or even getting to just finishing up like the tic-tac-toe. I think from here, all you really need to do is like determine whether or not like there is a winner, and then you're golden. Is there any other questions? Or anything I can like briefly go over in terms of, and also you can always reach out to me if you have any other questions. And yeah.
So we posted the slides on the Discord, and then on the slides of tutorials available. So we're gonna hang around for a little bit after. If you just want to keep on going through the tutorial, we'll be here. If you want to ask any questions, or if you get stuck at any point in the tutorial, you can also reach out to either of us on Discord as well.
Yeah, of course.
So here,
and yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm stopping the recording.